Hi there, this is Alvin, and welcome to the Kickstart Commerce podcast, where we share search marketing and domain investing strategies to help grow your business. In today's episode, our guest is Tieshun Roquerre, the CEO of Namebase.io, the premier domain registrar built on top of the new DNS protocol Handshake. Today, Tieshun and I dive deep into how engineering a platform to hawk t-shirts led to him dropping out of high school at the age of 16. 16, that's right, you heard me, dropping out of high school at the age of 16. Tieshun also shares how he and a partner were accepted into the Y Combinator after launching a recruiting startup for software engineering teams to grow via employee referrals. In addition, we discuss the inner workings and challenges of birthing Namebase.io only weeks before receiving a $100,000 Thiel Fellowship grant, yet a few months after dropping out of MIT. Yes, he's a dropout times 2. We also chat about the origins of Handshake and how both decentralized and centralized web ecosystems could possibly coexist. And last but not least, Tieshun drops nothing but nuggets about the Handshake domain auction process, including the pros and the cons of becoming a registry versus a Handshake domain owner / developer, as well as other use cases. And so with that, Tieshun, my man, welcome and thank you for making time to join us today.
Thanks for having me, Alvin.
Yeah, certainly. So to kick things off, Tieshun, share with the listeners at a high level a bit about yourself, who you are, your personal and professional background.
Yeah, just quick history. So I'm the CEO of Namebase, which is a domain registrar for the Handshake blockchain. And just for quick context, Handshake is effectively a decentralized domain name system built on the blockchain. And has a number of security and censorship resistance and usability improvements over traditional DNS. But that's what Namebase does, is we make it easy to use Handshake. And prior to that, I started a company that went through Y Combinator, which is a startup accelerator that funded Dropbox and Reddit, Airbnb, DoorDash, a bunch of companies that actually went IPOing this year. And I also went to school at MIT, where I met my co-founder, Anthony. That's actually kind of where we started Namebase out of. And I also did some engineering work before that. So that's kind of a quick about me.
Man, a quick about you. And I'm like, man, that is like jam-packed with so many different questions. One of the first questions that I thought was interesting is that you have a path that is unlike most. I mean, talk about a path that is less traveled. Now, you dropped out of high school. Now, I've got to know, like, what's the backstory there?
Yeah, it's kind of a funny story. I was always a fairly studious student, very academically oriented, but I just had a really great opportunity after my sophomore year, after my 10th grade in high school. I got to work at this company called Teespring. They were a Silicon Valley startup. They were growing like crazy. I think at the time that I joined them, they were doing $1 million a day in revenue.
Is that like a t-shirt company?
Yeah, it's a t-shirt company, which is a crazy thing. They're selling $1 million worth of t-shirts every day.
$1 million a day in t-shirts?
Yeah. It was kind of a crazy thing because basically these affiliate marketers, digital marketers, they discovered Teespring as a platform because it let you design a t-shirt and start selling it without any capital up front. And then they would just go and use, Facebook ads and basically just, you'd be like in Texas and be like, oh, like a male in Texas who likes cheese or something random like that. People would just like love those really personalized t-shirts and they just, bought them up. And that's kind of how it grew so much.
So it's almost like drop shipping, essentially.
Yeah, basically like for t-shirts.
That's crazy. So how did you stumble upon that opportunity?
Yeah, I was always, I think ever since I was 13, I had discovered Y Combinator, which is the startup accelerator that I mentioned. The founder of Y Combinator, Paul Graham, he is very well known in the tech world. He's written a lot of essays, so I kind of stumbled upon a few of his essays and kind of got sucked into it. And I had actually discovered Teespring because their founder had written a few blog posts as well about how much they were growing and like the technology and everything behind it. It was really cool because a lot of the people who were actually making a living on Teespring were not these already very successful people, but just your average everyday Joe, or even it would be like a stay-at-home mom like in the South who just like had some extra time in their hands, and they would just start designing these t-shirts and selling them. And then they were literally able to put their kids through college because of that. So that economic empowerment was something that I found very exciting. And it's actually kind of a theme that stayed with me, even into Namebase, which is a separate conversation. But effectively, I got very excited about that. And I ended up building a clone of Teespring in my spare time when I was in school. And at the end of my sophomore year, I basically emailed the CEO of Teespring and I was like, hey, I'm really excited about your company. I ended up building a clone. Is there any chance I could intern with y'all? And then they agreed. And so I got to go and intern with them for the summer. And then that one thing led to another. And I actually ended up working with them for a whole year after that. And I dropped out of high school in order to do that.
This man dropped out of high school to go follow his dreams, hawking t-shirts, y'all. Like, like who does that? And then first of all, I'm just kind of blown away by it. It's like awesome opportunity. But then I'm sitting there thinking to myself, like, Tieshun, like, what did your parents say about you dropping out?
Yeah, they're, surprisingly, because I'm half Chinese actually, and, my dad's white. I don't really have like a tiger mom. They've always been very supportive of me in terms of whatever decision I end up making for myself. And so they were kind of scared that I was moving from the East Coast to San Francisco and living on my own, but they also kind of trusted me. So they're just mostly encouraging and excited.
So you moved from the East Coast to San Francisco. I mean, how old were you? I mean, you were definitely probably just driving, I would imagine.
Yeah, I was 16 at the time. Although no driving in San Francisco was necessary because of Uber. They had a lot of credits. If you remember when Uber and Lyft was first getting big, they would just basically give you like free rides all the time. So didn't really need to drive.
That's great. So 16 years old, you're on your own, figuring life out, figuring out what you want to do. So you worked there at Teespring for a year, and then I guess what happened after that?
Yeah, so after about a year there, I was actually thinking of going back to school, but I ended up actually starting a company with my friend. It was a recruiting startup. We were basically trying to help tech companies grow their engineering teams through employee referrals. And we got really fortunate. We applied to Y Combinator and we ended up getting in. And that had always been a dream of mine. So I was expecting to, do that in my 20s, but just got really lucky, got in when I was 17 at the time. And ended up actually running that company for about a year. We raised money from, Y Combinator, of course, and also Greg Brockman, who's he was the CTO of Stripe and then now the co-founder of OpenAI. But we did that. And then near the end of it, I kind of realized that I actually did want to go back to school. So I applied to MIT, was really lucky and got in. And then I, went back home to study at MIT. But that was kind of the wrap up of that period in Silicon Valley for me.
Interesting. So, like, what lit that match inside to say, hey, I actually want to go back and attempt to do an undergrad, and especially at MIT?
Yeah, totally. So there were a few reasons. I mean, one was MIT is very technical and, I was an engineer, and then also it was in the East Coast, so it was close to my family. And actually a lot of the motivation was because, I had left school I had left school at 16, and so I didn't really get that time with my parents as much. And to be frank, I just missed them, and I wanted to be close to home so I could actually get that experience with them just for a little bit longer before going off my own again. So in a way, it was kind of homesickness. And then also, I think that there are just so many benefits to actually going to school, just like the education and also the social experience. I really got to kind of see how much harder it is to actually socialize in many ways once you're done with college, because college just puts thousands of kids all the same age and with the same general interests together, and this is a really unique environment. And so I knew that I was missing out on that to an extent. And also after being in Silicon Valley, I knew I could go back anytime. I had a bit of a network out there from my first few years working there, so it just made sense at the time for me to go and do that.
Now, in terms of timeline, so I guess when did you start MIT?
Yeah, I started MIT 2016, so when I was 18. So I actually got really lucky. It worked out where I ended up going to college the same year as all of my peers in high school. So basically, instead of doing my junior and senior year in high school, I just did my junior and senior year, working in Silicon Valley, and then ended up going to MIT for 2 years from 2016 to 2018. And then I started Namebase, and I got the Thiel Fellowship, it's a fellowship started by Peter Thiel. They give about $100,000 to students who drop out of college to start their own companies. So I was able to receive that, and then I left MIT to start Namebase.
Well, okay. So now that answers the next question, because I was like, okay, what precipitated you to say, okay, I'm dropping out a second time, and now I understand it was $100,000 check that, okay, hey, if you drop out, here's $100,000, go do your thing. Now, in terms of
so actually,
Namebase,
funnily enough, it was actually it was after dropping out that I had applied to the fellowship and got it. So it was actually Namebase itself that led me to dropping out. But after doing it, just receiving the fellowship on top was kind of like a nice cherry on top.
So then you're in MIT, and then now how does Namebase come about?
Yeah, totally. So it was really serendipitous in a lot of ways because I had met my co-founder, Anthony. He studied computer science and focused on cybersecurity. And he was, probably the best engineer that I've ever met from MIT. I actually met him because I asked one of my friends, FA, who was he also kind of was part of a recruiting company at the time while in school. So he kind of just knew everyone. I asked him who the best builders that he knew at school were. And then he introduced me to Anthony. But basically, we were going and looking at a bunch of different ideas. We were building projects on the side. We just kind of wanted to build something. And we discovered Handshake because one of our friends and also investors, Eric Melser, shared the white paper with us. And when we read through the white paper, we're both engineers. We don't come from a domain investing background, so we both come from an engineering background. And when we just internalized what Handshake was and what the possibilities were, we got very excited because it really just provides a step function improvement to the domain name system that literally is just not possible today in terms of the architecture. And once we kind of realized what was possible, we also kind of were thinking through what the potential limitations would be and what could hinder its adoption. And we realized that, we would need some sort of service that makes it really easy to use, because not only do developers not want to use things that are difficult to use, but also, end users, domainers, everyone, you kind of need some sort of convenient interface. The same thing happened with Bitcoin when Coinbase was created to make it finally easy for consumers to adopt Bitcoin. So that's really kind of how Namebase came about. As we discovered Handshake, we got really excited about the potential. And then we decided to start Namebase in order to make Handshake adoption possible.
That's interesting. So you really then kind of had Coinbase at a parallel of seeing a bit of its success and not necessarily say copycat, but there are things that, you can actually lift it or transferable to put into your own project, given your own context then.
Yeah, definitely. Really when looking at the history of cryptocurrency adoption and also just adoption of various technologies in general, we kind of knew that there would need to be some sort of consumer-friendly interface. And so the vision for Namebase was always kind of like a combination of GoDaddy and Coinbase to an extent. And the Coinbase part is necessary because Handshake is a blockchain protocol. There is a token involved, and you need some way to acquire that token in order to use the protocol, at least in terms of owning the domains. And so we needed to create a way for people to be able to purchase them and trade those tokens and then use those tokens. And so that's what we initially set out to build.
I guess this is all of what, 2019?
This is 2018, actually.
So still 2018. And then, so you and Anthony, y'all hook up, and then I guess now kind of walk us through just the timeline of, I guess, did you come up with the Namebase first, or was it actually a functional prototype? Just kind of walk us through everything.
Yeah, totally. So at the time, the Handshake white paper was just released, and the team behind it was estimating, a launch within like 3 months. And it actually ended up not, it got delayed because blockchain protocols are very difficult to engineer and build. And so it actually only ended up launching in February of 2020. So we were a little bit early, but at the time, we thought it was launching very quickly. We went out and raised money to build Namebase. We ended up raising $4 million from Coinbase itself actually invested. Also Fred Ursum, who's Coinbase's co-founder, who runs a fund called Paradigm, Thrive Capital, Steve Jang, who was one of the first investors into Uber, and a number of other individuals, including Balaji Srinivasan, who's also very, very prominent within crypto. So I ended up raising the money, and then we started building Namebase. And then basically Handshake got delayed in terms of its launch by about a year and a half. And during that time, we just kept on building Namebase because that's actually, we also underestimated how difficult it would be to build not only cryptocurrency on-ramp, so you can buy the HNS tokens with your US USD or Bitcoin, but also building out the bidding system so that you can actually go and bid on the Handshake names. And I can talk about how that entire dynamic works. But building all of that out and making sure that it was secure and reliable actually took a considerable amount of time. So then, 2 years later, when Handshake launched in February 2020, we had just been ready to actually go and support the launch. And we launched on the same day as the Handshake mainnet went live. And then from there, we've been continuing to build to work to support the ecosystem, which has been, growing exponentially, which is obviously incredible to see.
Now, for the listeners who are coming into this conversation in terms of hearing about Handshake protocol or Handshake domains, HNS, they're hearing namebase.io for the first time. So in terms of this white paper, juxtapose a bit about the decentralized internet and what's going on with Handshake, juxtapose it towards the legacy system or the current day internet that we use. Like, how are the two different, and why would anyone ever move, or any company, person, anyone ever make that move to go towards decentralized web or DWeb?
Totally. Yeah, great question. So, in a nutshell, Handshake is a decentralized DNS protocol. Functionally, what it allows you to do is you can use the protocol to register top-level domain names on Handshake that you basically can truly own and control. Something that Handshake did was protocol basically lets you register any TLD that's not an ICANN TLD, right? And that's important because you need the alternative route to support compatibility with the existing route. And once you own it, you can actually go and use it as your own TLD. You can sell subdomains off of it. You can create your own websites off of it. You can even use the route itself as a website. So you can use, for example, if you go to nb.hns.to in your browser. So hns.to is a gateway for Handshake. NB is a TLD that we own, NB for Namebase. Right. You can actually go and visit our website there. But effectively, it's this decentralized DNS protocol. And the reason why you want that, there are a number of reasons. And I'll just go from the purely technical to the more, cultural zeitgeist that kind of surrounds it. But from a technical perspective, it actually allows you to have much higher security guarantees for the internet, because you can replace certificate authorities, which are currently like a trusted third party in every internet connection, with a distributed root of trust, which is a blockchain. And this is really one of the primary reasons for anything to be on a blockchain. It's really about trust. So in the existing internet, basically the only way to solve a trust problem is to rely on a third party or a cluster of third parties to delegate trust to them. Because prior to blockchains, there really wasn't any other way of encoding trust other than some sort of trusted institution. And then now with blockchains, you can basically engineer a set of incentives and using cryptography to actually have a distributed system that you can just fully trust in terms of the data that's on record. And you can basically make a number of assumptions that show, okay, unless someone has this much money and this much mining power, they can't actually compromise the network. That's what gives Bitcoin so much security. It's like, in order to do a double spend on Bitcoin, you would need to have, I don't know how much it is at this point, it's probably billions of dollars. And then also, even once you have that, you would need to be able to sustain that cost advantage over time, which is just like, there are a number of reasons why it's just like can't really do that. It's very, very hard. And so what Handshake does is it allows you to get rid of the root of trust and the ICANN-based system, which relies on certificate authorities. And there's also this like key signing ceremony and stuff that happens every few months. And you can replace it with the blockchain. But in addition to that, you can also decentralize the governance of the top-level domain system, so that instead of having an organization like ICANN manage it and charge $185,000 for application fees and actually not even issue new GLTs, on Handshake, all of the TLDs are issued through a decentralized auction system, which is fully permissionless. Anyone in the world can participate, and they can actually register the names directly and know them themselves. And so that's something that's been really exciting for people, for a lot of domainers, right? Like, Andrew Rosner is getting into it. We have Mike Carson, who runs Park.io. He's gone into it really heavily and even started a company around Handshake. So that's really the aspect that gets a lot of people excited about it, is you can actually own your own TLD, and it's decentralized. So it's truly owned by you. You don't have to pay anyone, fees to go and use it. And then on top of that, you also have the cultural zeitgeist now that the current internet is facing, which is, if you've seen the recent months, really everything's kind of happening all at once. We have, Trump getting deplatformed on all the social media websites. We have Parler getting shut down, across the entire internet stack. So a lot of internet service providers like AWS and Twilio, et cetera, they actually, shut Parler off from their services. And then we have GameStop, having their trading halting, and that hearing's going on right now. Wall Street Bets getting deplatformed on Discord. So basically what's happening is the centralized internet is kind of facing a reckoning, because as the power and control has consolidated, the issues around censorship have also grown and magnified. And now there's kind of this huge wave towards decentralization, where people really want to use these core, infrastructure primitives without having any, centralized party, or in many cases, an individual just in control and able to, deplatform people at will. And so that's kind of a huge cultural reason for why Handshake's been growing so much recently, is because there is this wave towards decentralization. And then there have been a number of second order effects as a result of that. And also just a number of other considerations for why people are excited about it. But those are kind of the primary reasons, is the technology. It provides a better foundation for DNS, just from a security, censorship resistance, and ownership perspective. But then also the centralized systems are all kind of failing now too. And so there's a cultural pull towards decentralization.
Yeah, because hey, the cancel culture is real. I was about to say culture, which is true too, unfortunately, but the cancel culture is real. And that's something that's being, like you said, witnessed in the centralized realm of, people thinking, and I think a lot of people think this just at a high level, that because you own a legacy domain or legacy TLD, as referred to with like .com, .net, .org, and so forth, that a lot of people think that when they pay the money that they pay, it's really, you're paying on a lease of an annual basis. And guess what? It can be taken away at any moment without really any reason as to why. And a lot of people don't know that in terms of just dealing with the centralized internet, or the internet of today. One thing that you hit on that I think is quite interesting between the two worlds of DWeb, and then just so if we say centralized versus decentralized, is that when dealing with ICANN, and you mentioned it, that for me to become a TLD owner, I essentially have to throw down $185,000 application fee. And that's not even, that's just the bare minimum of getting me started. Because let's just say, for instance, you and I were after the same TLD. Well, likely is the case, it's going to go to auction. We've got to pay even more money to win that, or to own it. And then I think it's like an extra $25,000 a year or something like that of fees to basically be able to remain, I guess, the owner of that TLD. And so when you look at the cost of what the centralized web is costing in terms of being an owner of a TLD versus Handshake, to me it seems like there is a quite dwarfed comparison. It's like, I look at Handshake and I go, man, it's like pennies on the dollar, if you will. But at the same time, it's also kind of one of those things of like, well, you get what you pay for. So like, help me understand, how in the world is it that any and everyone now looking at the decentralized web can actually go out, own, if you will, a proverbial stream? Because I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, oh, great, I can go to the decentralized web and now I can actually own services or solutions as a TLD. So help us understand the cost, but then also help us understand what type of strings that we can own and cannot own.
Yeah, that's a great question. And you're totally on point there, which is, in addition to the application fee itself, there's also the cost of the TLD. And really at minimum, you're going to be spending like $1 million if you're trying to actually own a TLD and kind of run it. And if you look at kind of the secondary market for TLDs, that's kind of like the minimum bar for the spend. And so on Handshake, basically what you can register are any TLD that's not in existing ICANN TLD. In addition to that, in order to incentivize existing stakeholders in brands to be willing to adopt Handshake and use it, they also reserve the top 100,000 Alexa domain names as TLDs. Okay. So for example, only google.com can claim .google. And when I say they reserved, I don't mean that there's no Handshake Foundation. There's no centralized team behind Handshake. The initial creators actually created a foundation for Handshake just to launch the protocol, and then the foundation dissolved after that. So all of these rules that I'm mentioning, they're basically encoded directly into the blockchain, and so they can't be changed or modified. And so it's really this permissionless system. But effectively, you can register any string that's not, ICANN TLD or Alexa top 100,000 domain name. And then if you have one of those Alexa top 100,000 domain names, you can actually go and claim your domain as a TLD. In terms of, that cost differential, you're right, because if you look at the, the name sales, we have a number of stats available at namebase.io /stats. And you can see a bunch of the stats there. But even the most expensive TLD, .nft, that was purchased for $84,000. So wow. $84,000, yeah. And actually that was a really great flip. And Namebase helped facilitate the escrow for that. It was purchased, I think, in August by a domainer for about $500, and then basically just like a few months later was sold for $84,000. And then actually. Crazy. Yeah, it has been really crazy. And then also just if you look at the marketplace volume, that's been growing exponentially. In February, prior to February, the marketplace volume was maybe around like 100K or a few hundred K per month. And then in February, it was close to $1 million for the secondary market for the TLDs. So the names are actually very quickly catching up. But even then, right, it's like, okay, $84,000, that's still a far shy away from the $1 million cost that traditional TLDs have. Right. And I think really the primary reason for that cost differential and that arbitrage is really just because Handshake is still so early in its adoption curve. Even given the recent influx of all of the users into the ecosystem and the adopters, it's still the number of people who are aware of it is orders of magnitude smaller than the number of people that will be aware of it in a few years, or the number of people that are aware of ICANN TLDs. And then also there's a certain unknown factor if you're kind of new to the market in terms of, how will Handshake get adopted? How will it succeed? And I have answers to those questions. I can share those and kind of thoughts around that. But because they haven't happened yet, you have to price in that uncertainty into the names as well. And so, the names of course are not going to be selling for as high as they will be once browsers adopt it, or once there's more public DNS resolvers for them, and those things are all happening. But until they, are actually real, you always have to kind of price in uncertainty. That's just kind of how the markets work. So it's a combination of just general, early in its adoption cycle, there's not as much competition and just like competing buyers as there will be in a few years. And then also because it's in its infancy, the usability and adoption is still very early. And so that has to be priced in as well.
Now, let me ask you this. So with a Handshake TLD or domain, then like what is the renewal, and is the renewal forever?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's no renewal fees for Handshake TLDs. Once you own it, you basically have the right to own it forever. There is a heartbeat transaction that you need to submit every 2 years. And then if you bought your name and Namebase, we actually just take care of this for you and cover the transaction fees for you. But basically, you just need to submit a transaction that proves that you still have control of the name. Because we've all seen those stories of people losing tens of millions of dollars worth of Bitcoin from right. forgetting their password or throwing out a hard drive. And that's honestly fine for Bitcoin, right? Because for a fungible token like Bitcoin, losing Bitcoins basically just decreases the overall supply of all Bitcoins. So it's almost like a nice thing for people, not for the people who lose it, but for the entire ecosystem. When there's less Bitcoins in circulation, that actually pushes the price up, makes the Bitcoins that you have more valuable. But in a non-fungible system, when it comes to names, if someone loses their TLD, right? If someone loses the buyer of .nft, if they lose the keys to .nft or they lose access to it, now that name is just taken out of circulation forever. And then if people bought subdomains off of that, and if they're using Alvin.nft, if you have that, or I'm using Tieshun.nft, but then suddenly it's just like the keys are lost forever. Now that name basically just gets wiped out. And so you can get entire swaths of namespace that become unusable over time if people are losing their keys. So that's obviously an unacceptable issue without the heartbeat. So the heartbeat transaction basically just proves to the system that you still have control of your name. And as long as you can submit that heartbeat transaction every 2 years, then you continue to maintain control of the name. And there's no cost associated with the name other than submitting a transaction, which usually, if you are familiar with how blockchains work, there comes with a miner fee. You can even submit a transaction with a zero miner fee and just, hope that someone picks it up and puts it into one of their blocks that they're mining, just altruistically. So you could even do that. So there's basically no inherent cost to it. And even for, if you're trying to, add a miner fee to it, it's like a few cents renewal. So it's effectively free.
Right, because I think I was looking through a couple of auctions and I saw it was something like 40 cents, or something like that. It may have been 4 cents. I can't remember, but I do remember seeing it, and I was like, man, that's nominal in comparison to today's, typical .com renewal fee.
Yeah, totally. And also, if you just like think about the system, there's this kind of concept called wholesale pricing transfer. Is it wholesale value transfer? Basically, what happens is when you have someone earlier in the supply chain, so in this case, it's like, VeriSign owning .com, or like ICANN controlling the TLDs, because they're at the beginning of that supply chain, they have all the pricing power and they can go and increase their prices and capture, continue to capture more and more of the value created on top of the ecosystem. Right. So now, VeriSign, they just got their pricing restrictions lifted. And so now the prices of .coms are going to increase over time. Really the long-term play of that is that the real estate owners, like the existing TLD owners of today, they're going to increasingly be able to capture more and more of the value on top of domains. And it's really by just giving access to people to actually own their own TLDs, right? Creating more real estate owners in this digital landscape. It's only by doing that can we actually democratize more of the access and actually democratize more of the pricing power.
Which is really interesting, because it kind of points back to, when you first initially started and you were explaining about how you and Anthony read the white paper and you addressed certain things in terms of the DNS. And so you're looking at the pros and cons of what the current existing day DNS is. And then it's like you've come alongside to address many of those issues and challenges and simplify it along the way, is essentially kind of what I take in. Is that correct?
Yeah. So there's a lot of different nuances involved. There's nuances involved with both bidding on Handshake names and the renewal and all this stuff. And so basically we built an interface that abstracts all that away so that it works kind of intuitively to how you would think it should work. And, so you can actually go and use your US dollars to go and get into the Handshake ecosystem and start using it. And then we also built a marketplace on top of that. So you can actually go and acquire names that you are interested in, but someone else is registered, various things like that. So that's kind of all we've built. In addition to some other things like the name-based registry, which lets you sell subdomains off your TLD. That's something that I'm actually really excited about as well. And I can talk about in a bit, but that's what you said in a nutshell is correct.
So then let's talk a bit about, because I did an interview with Mike Carson and Steve Webb of Park.io and Gateway.io, and I knew nothing about Handshake. Man, I thought they were talking about high-fiving and actual physical handshake and dapping one another up. I was like, y'all got to break this down to a brother. And so we did the interview, broke it down, and that was like early 2020, January, February, early 2020. Matter of fact, I think it was it was after NamesCon, so it had to be like February 2020. And so they were telling me about all this. And then during the interview, they looked up my name, Alvin Brown. They're like, yeah, it's going to be released. And I still had no, reference or anything for any of this stuff. And so fast forward a year. So basically it's March 1st at the time of this recording. So February rolls around, actually the end of January, I was going to NamesCon and I had set a reminder from that original podcast. And it popped up and was like, hey, your Handshake name is going to become available. And so I gone out, I remember namebase.io, and I was actually pleasantly pleased at how simple it was to actually get set up. I did have a little confusion in terms of how to fund the account, but that was all remedied within about 24 hours when I received a message like, hey, you can actually fund USD. And so I was able to do that, get the funds there. And then I just start playing around. I took a list of keywords or strings or domains or TLDs, however you want to classify them, and literally start looking them up and saw some of them had been released. And then I started an auction. And so to a certain extent, now walk us through what is a Victory auction and why did you choose that auction versus the traditional auction whereby, hey, in the traditional auction, whoever bids the highest at that last second before the auction ends is the winner. Like, why did you all go away from that into the Victory auction?
Great question. For context, what Namebase does is we facilitate the interacting with the auctions on the Handshake blockchain, but they're not actually happening on Namebase itself. They're happening on the Handshake blockchain. And so all the rules around the auctions basically are determined by the rules on the Handshake blockchain. As a side note, we are actually creating auctions for the secondary market so that we can actually have that function differently. But for the blockchain auctions, they are run through a Victory auction because in terms of how the blockchain works, because all the transactions are public, you basically need to have the system that Handshake encodes, where it's like a Victory auction, you submit a bid and I submit a bid, right? Let's say we're both bidding on Alvin. And let's say you submit a bid for 10,000 HNS and I submit a bid for 5,000 HNS. You end up winning that name. And you only end up paying 5,000 HNS. And you're not paying 5,000 HNS to Namebase or any entity. Those coins actually get burned on the blockchain. So it creates this deflationary mechanism. And the auction format was basically engineered that way because in a normal server, client server application with an auction system, you can have a system where someone's submitting, a bid and they can re-up their bid and they're submitting bids all the way up to the last second. They can submit multiple bids and multiple changes, etc. But in a blockchain system, it's slower than that, right? You can't really support as many transactions that quickly. And you basically don't really want to have a system where people are re-upping their bid and making a lot of changes and doing all sorts of transactions. You really want someone to just submit a single bid and have that be their true bid. And the best auction, there's all sorts of game theory involved with the auctions, but one auction format that basically results in this behavior being like the most optimal behavior is a blind Victory auction, which is, which is basically how Handshake works. It's like if you are bidding and I'm bidding and we don't know what the other person is going to bid, and also we only ever pay the second highest price, it's basically like theoretically optimal for us to both submit our true bid, the true maximum price that we're willing to pay, because we'll never pay more than that, and we'll only ever pay the second highest bid price. So that's why Handshake uses a Victory auction, is because you don't really have the capability of doing the normal auction where people can re-up and bid to the last second and change their bids and whatnot. And you really want to incentivize just people submitting a single bid and not really clogging the blockchain with transactions. And so that's why a Victory auction was chosen.
Okay. So then help me understand this in this example then. So I place a bid at, let's just say 500, but then I also add 1,000 HNS blind to it, for a total of 1,500, I guess, lockup amount. Mm-hmm. And so let's go with two different scenarios. First scenario, I'm the only one that bids. Kind of walk me through there. So I'm assuming then that 500 gets burned and I get back the blind, or kind of what happens there?
Yeah, so you're introducing this very important concept, which is a blind in Handshake. So basically, if you bid 500 HNS and you add a blind of 1,000 HNS, what's public on the network is that there's a total lockup for your bid of 1,500 HNS. So no one knows whether you bid, 500, your true bid is 500 HNS or 1,500 HNS or 1 HNS or 1,499 HNS. It could be any number within that range. They just know that your bid is, from 0 to 1,500. And in the case of submitting that bid and there being no one else bidding, then you would actually win that name and pay 0 HNS. So the second highest price in that case is 0 HNS. So you would get that name for free, actually. But if someone submitted a 600 HNS bid, so your true bid was 500 HNS, even with 1,000 HNS blind, that's not used in terms of the calculation. It's just your actual bid amount. So if someone else bid 600 HNS, then they would actually win your name and they would just pay 500 HNS, the bid that you submitted. That's the second highest bid price. So that 500 HNS would get burned from their pool.
But you would get basically the 1,500 back.
Exactly. Yeah. When you bid, there's no risk of losing, that blind. And also if you lose the auction, you get all of the HNS that you bid back. And the reason why the blind exists, and this is also, again, another, fairly technical reason. And so we do our best to kind of explain just the mechanics, but in terms of the why, it's fairly, esoteric. But essentially on Handshake and on the blockchain, all the transactions are public. And for a Victory auction, in order for a Victory auction to work, it needs to be blind, right? Because if someone can see what your bid is, like the dynamic just changes. So on the blockchain, you can't really do the blind auction, but what you can do is introduce a blind so that no one actually knows the true amount. So basically it's just like a technicality, because you can't really do like a true blind bid. They introduce the concept of a blind to make it easier to obscure the true value of your bid, so that at least you can kind of introduce some, blinding to an extent, like a blinding factor. So it's basically just like a result of how the blockchain works and what the limitations are. But that's really the reason.
And it gets real interesting because you start talking about the blind and not being able to see, and you're having to do it's like you said, it's really driving to the heart of just place your best bid and hope for the best, because you really don't know where someone has placed, their bid. Obviously, you know what the limits are, but you don't know what's in between. And they could be one off. They could be, one on, meaning, hey, from 0, they just bid 1 HNS, or they could be one off from that limit. And instead of 1,500, it's 1,499. But regardless, it's like you have to make that personal decision to say, hey, this is what I'm doing. This is as much as I'm willing to pay, and just kind of let the chips fall where they may, if you will. Now, that's one complexity to this. Now, the other that I thought was interesting, and it was one that I ran into where I fooled around, and because you don't necessarily know what's going in auction when or where in terms of keywords, I fooled around and tied up all my HNS on a bid. And lo and behold, a keyword comes that I was like, oh, shoot, I really wanted to bid, but obviously I needed to fund the account, and I was funding from a bank account. And so interesting enough, that took a couple of days to get there. And it just so happens that when I found out about the given key, the string, it was like 2 days left. So by the time I even got the funds there, got HNS tokens purchased, then, it was like auction was over. So, walk us through in terms of timing of an overall auction, because, to a certain extent, I learned a lesson in terms of, hey, you can fool around and tie up your HNS, I think somewhere between like 10 to 15 days. And so kind of walk us through, at least, take a string, for example, and say, hey, to start an auction, I think it takes, X amount of days. So kind of walk us through this process.
Yeah, great question. So the entire process from start to finish for an auction is about 15 days, 2 weeks. And there's a 5-day auction bidding period followed by a 10-day reveal period. So the 5-day period is really just the period that you have to submit your bid. At the end of those 5 days, the reveal period starts, which is when you can go and reveal the true value of your bid, right? So if you bid 500 HNS with a 1000 HNS blind, that's a 1500 HNS lockup. But in order to determine the winner, you need everyone to reveal, what was a bid and what was a blind. And so during the reveal period, everyone goes and reveals that. And actually, if you don't reveal, you actually lose all of your bid and your lockup. So that's just like irredeemable.
Ouch.
Yeah, but Namebase, this is like one of those complications that at Namebase we just completely automate that for everyone, and so you never actually have to worry about revealing or losing your bid or etc. So it just handles that automatically. But basically, during that 10-day reveal period, you reveal the bid, the winner is determined, and then the winner can claim their name. So in essence, 5-day bid period, 10-day reveal period. That's the entire auction. And there is another dynamic, which is when you first open an auction, there's actually like a 6-hour open period. But basically, that's negligible. It's like when you first kick off an auction, let's say you find a name and it hasn't been registered by someone yet, you can basically start an auction for that. And then after 6 hours, that bid will submit. And you don't have to wait for 6 hours if you're using Namebase. You can just put in your bid and then we'll actually schedule that bid for the 6 hours later when the auction is available to start. But that is another dynamic. The thing that you mentioned about having to wait for the USD to kind of settle, that's really interesting. That is like a pretty tricky dynamic that catches people off guard. Sometimes we're working on a few things to make that easier. One stopgap solution that you can actually leverage is you can also buy HNS with Bitcoin. So when you go to namebase.io and you go to the buy HNS in the navigation,
right.
You click buy, you can actually navigate and buy with Bitcoin instead, and that'll settle within an hour. So if you ever have like a time pressing HNS purchase that you need to complete, then you can always leverage that too.
No, that's awesome. I think just in my time here, basically, a month now, in terms of playing on the platform, being around just in the community, one of the things that strikes me is this whole, I guess, thought around gifting names. And so, like, where did that come from?
That's a great question. So the gifting is, on Namebase, we created this feature that allows you to gift a name via email. And it really has resulted in some amazing emergent behavior, which is a lot of the domainers. And also there's one who's been doing an incredible job. He goes by the nickname Handshake Jesus. I think his real name is Jesse, because on Clubhouse, I've seen him as Handshake Jesse. But he's been gifting some like really high value names, like even names that have cost thousands of dollars to register, right? Because it's a victory auction. So some names can go for free up to, the highest name that I think the highest auction was around like $50,000, and then the highest secondary sale was like $84,000. So there's a huge variance in terms of the cost of the names. But Crypto Jesus, Handshake Jesus, has been gifting some really amazing names. And I think the reason for why the community has adopted that culture is because, ultimately, regardless of what great names you have, the value of your portfolio will increase by orders of magnitude if Handshake gets true adoption. Right now, we're seeing really the early innings of it, right? It's a curiosity for many people, right? Like Andrew Rosner actually puts it in a really good way. He has a huge, I think he's like the #1 domainer, like on escrow.com, and like by many metrics, like in the world, sells a ton of domain names, has a huge portfolio, and he's got into Handshake as of a year ago. He was looking at it and he kind of thought of it as a kind of like toy project, just something to look at for fun. And then now he's increasingly like, okay, the traditional internet is kind of failing, right? He sees a lot of the issues happening with centralization and consolidation, and really everything that happened in January of 2021 is kind of like a wake up call. And now he increasingly sees it as a hedge for his portfolio, because if the internet continues to kind of go down this trajectory, which is basically the thesis that we had as of 3 years ago. So it's been incredible and frightening to see it play out, where just 3 years later, it's actually kind of entering into the mainstream, kind of consumer thought process, which is that, the centralization of the internet is actually a huge failure point and causing a lot of problems. But basically, he's, increasingly getting into it as a hedge. So right now, it's gone from toy to hedge, and then the future is when it becomes an inevitable resource and infrastructure for the entire internet, right? And that's really the end game that Handshake is vying for, is that it is like the best naming system that can be like technically constructed. And as the existing internet continues to fail, there will increasingly be reason to flock over to the decentralized internet that Handshake enables. And there's also this year, the development and maturity of a number of decentralized web protocols like IPFS and Filecoin and Skynet. If you're familiar with crypto, you might have heard of some of these, but they're basically, decentralized storage systems, decentralized compute. And we're basically starting to see the building blocks for an entire decentralized internet that gives a lot more power to individuals and takes away and mitigates the issues that come from centralized platforms. So if you're someone who's in the Handshake ecosystem, hoarding names to an extent is, going to provide value to you, but it's not going to provide nearly as much value as helping Handshake actually gain adoption, which will just increase the value of everything by orders of magnitude. So I think, that's kind of like the root reason for why the altruism is even possible, is because there's so much more room to expand the pie than just kind of cornering little pieces of the pie. And then a lot of the, prolific gifters, they also have their own portfolios, right? And so it's fine for them to go and do that. And ultimately that's what will help the community succeed, is by bringing more people into the community. We can bring more people into the movement and grow the entire ecosystem, and that'll bring more value to everyone.
Yeah, and the thing that struck me as odd in this is that, and it's one of the things that you kind of hit there in terms of what's going on, or what's often accused of in the legacy domain world of, hey, all of the good names are taken. You had to be there in 1990. Everybody has hoarded all the good names away. But that's not necessarily the case in terms of this whole Handshake domain and decentralized web. And so now walk me through and kind of explain to our listeners a bit about what kind of stop guard was put in place whereby that no one person could actually come in and hoard all of the given strings or names.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so for context, there have been many alternative root attempts in the past, right? And prior to blockchain, there were even, centralized alternative routes. And I can share reasons for why, all those failed and why, this time is different, or, some theses for why this time is different. It's kind of similar to how prior to Bitcoin, there were numerous attempts at digital currencies in the 90s, and they all failed. And then it wasn't until Bitcoin arrived in 2008 that the first cryptocurrency actually succeeded and went mainstream. But basically, in the blockchain space, there is another protocol called Namecoin that was a predecessor to Handshake. And one of the issues with Namecoin is that it didn't have an auction system. So all the names were sold for a set price. And I think that price actually trended down over time. And in addition to that, there was no limitation preventing early adopters from registering all the names on day one. So, on the first day of Namecoin launch, basically the handful of people who heard about it could just go in and register all of the good names. And that's exactly what happened. We actually, a lot of the community members were aware of Namecoin, of course, and even participated in that ecosystem. And so they were just telling me oh yeah, I would just go down the list and just register all these brand names and all these, premium names, et cetera. And then I just hoarded them. And they can do that because their cost basis was effectively zero. And that's a huge issue for any naming system, because if that happens in a naming system before mass adoption occurs, then the early adopters are basically just preventing any latecomers or any newcomers from being incentivized to actually come into the ecosystem and grow it, right? If you can't get any of the digital real estate, then what incentive do you have to actually go and get your own digital real estate and help it grow? So the distribution of names is really, really important. And two things were done in order to ensure that the distribution would be more spread out, so that more people in the ecosystem would have access to the names and be willing to grow it. One was the auction system. So instead of the names being sold for a set price, the name is sold for the second highest bid price. And so that ensures that the more premium names go to the people who are want it the most, right? And as I mentioned, I think the highest names sold directly through the auction system was Dot Wallet, which went for 350,000 HNS. That's about like
Wow.
100. Yeah, so about $100,000 worth of HNS at the current price. And then on the secondary market is $84,000. And then on top of that, there was also a rollout period within the first year. So we're actually past that first year now, which is great because now there's also a lot more people in the ecosystem. So, on any name, you're going to get a little competition, but still like a lot less competition than you will, in a year or two. But basically that rollout period limited the names so that on day one, you can only register a certain portion of the names. And then, 6 months in, you could register more of the names. And then, 11 months in, you could register even more of the names. So that's why when you saw it in February, you weren't able to register your name until later in the year because your name wasn't released yet. And that ensured that people who came in 11 months in would still be able to, have access to a lot of the good names, and more people could come into the ecosystem. And that was the dynamic and mechanic that Handshake built into the protocol, so that you wouldn't have this issue of, just like 5 early adopters hoarding all of the good names and just basically limiting the growth of the ecosystem.
And there you have it. All the good names are not taken. They are not taken. And I'm actually, man, I'm surprised at just some of the names that I've come across and have added to my own watch list. And it has just been phenomenal to see that. And so that's one of the things that when I look at the legacy world and I go, oh man, yeah, okay, that may be the case that, folks were able just to go through and just purchase all the names outright. Great. All right. That happened. But it's interesting to see, again, you looking at Namecoin and then, the legacy system in itself to kind of correct what went proverbial wrong back then and make it right in this current setup. And so I think it's definitely going to be one of those situations that sets people up for success. Now, in terms of, and those are
and I would just add on to that, if I may, real quick, which is there's only been about 500,000 or maybe 700,000 names now that have been registered on Handshake. And if you think about how many names are registered in the traditional domain name system, right, like 400 million, you can see we're just multiple orders of magnitude away from that. So that on its own just kind of shows you how early everything is, and that many TLDs is amazing, right? Because there's only 1,500 TLDs in the traditional system, and there's already 700,000 in the Handshake system. But also the use cases are a lot more varied. We're still very early into that, and we're actually building out, more infrastructure to support more use cases at Namebase. But Handshake, if you think about it, you can just use it as a traditional domain, right? So if you have .brown, you can have Alvin.brown, you can just use it for that reason.
I wish I had .brown. That bad boy's reserved.
Oh, really? It must be for like Brown. I don't know. There's probably like a name in the Alexa Top 100K that has Brown. But that just kind of goes to my point, which is you can use it as a domain name, but you can also use it as a TLD itself, right? So like Alvin.brown, that last name is something that's valuable, probably more valuable in Handshake than as a traditional domain. And then also now you have these names that not only can be used as domain names, but it can also be used as TLDs. So then in terms of thinking, what would be good for really good subdomains, right? It's like .nft is like a great TLD, and now you can have subdomains off of that. So that changes which names are desirable. But also you can use Handshake names as decentralized identifiers. We actually are working on infrastructure now that lets you use your Handshake name to use decentralized login. So you can actually authenticate into a website using your Handshake name. So now that changes. Instead of having, .brown, you might want to have Alvin Brown, right? And Alvin Brown, it can be your username, or you can just use any random username. And so now you have these usernames that are really valuable on Handshake. And that's something that's not really as much of a dynamic in the traditional domaining sense. And then on top of that, you can also use Handshake names for decentralized social applications. And we're working with the founder of Sky's Skynet, which is a decentralized storage provider. And this is actually something that I'm ridiculously excited about, which is it's actually possible to build decentralized social alternatives to Reddit and Twitter that effectively maintain the same usability of those sites, but there's no centralized platform that's in control of those systems. It's basically accomplishing the goal. Twitter has a team that's trying to decentralize Twitter, and it's basically accomplishing that goal with the technology that we have today. And it basically just became available, this technology, within the last few months. So we're really excited on sharing more about that. But now when you think about Handshake being used in that context, it basically just really opens up the use cases that these names are valuable for, which also means that the strings that will accrue value changes, right? And so if you're clever about it, you can actually go and preempt a lot of those use cases, kind of get into them. And there's value, there's arbitrage there. And even the existing system, right? Like on the marketplace today, people are making thousands of dollars just flipping the names that are even just being used as like traditional domain names. So it's like we're still very early in the market. So like there's this kind of like early adopter arbitrage available right now anyway. But then there's also this entire next wave of growth around the use cases that we just haven't even started getting into yet. So there's just like a lot of potential.
So I didn't even realize that then. So my Handshake domain, Alvin Brown, which was gifted to me actually by Christopher Moore. So thank you, Christopher Moore. He ensured that I got it because that was one of the ones that I saw come across the radar, and I had locked up all my HNS, y'all. Like, don't ask me why. I was heartbroken. I was like, I'm probably not going to get it. And then lo and behold, thanks to Christopher Moore, gifting me with my name. And so I didn't realize that then at some point I can actually use that as a username. And so that'll certainly be interesting. I think I set up I want to say it was like a D-links on Alvin Brown. And so, so obviously don't go out to Google. If you're listening to this right now, it's March 1st, 2021. You can't go out to Google Chrome right now and type in Alvin Brown / or .Alvin Brown and get there. Obviously, you're going to either do this a couple of ways. One is if you're using Puma browser, and then I believe now there are a couple plugins, right?
Yeah, so there are a number of Chrome extensions that support Handshake. We're actually just releasing now a public DNS resolver at hdns.io. And it works similar to Cloudflare's 1.1 and Google's 8.8. Basically, you can change a single setting in your computer and be able to visit Handshake websites across all your browsers. And you can also do this on your phone as well. Although if you're on iPhone, Puma browser is great because it supports Handshake natively in its browser, and it's a crypto-focused browser. And then there's also community efforts to get Brave to support Handshake, and so we're kind of ratcheting it up. Going from the smaller browsers all the way up to the larger browsers is the end goal. But there are numerous ways to go and access Handshake sites. You can also use hns.to, as I mentioned. So I just went to alvinbrown.hns.to, and I can confirm you have a D-link there, right? You have a decentralized profile at Alvin Brown, which is really cool.
Yep, I do. And so tell me this then, does ICANN ever go away?
Yeah, I think that ICANN will not go away just because they'll still maintain control of the 1,500 TLDs. Those will still be under their jurisdiction. But I do think that the end game of this is that ICANN will have much less influence over the root namespace than they do today. And that's kind of the trend that you're just seeing across every industry via technology, is that the protocols that give more power to the people and more power to the individuals ultimately end up growing bigger than the centralized protocols themselves, and basically just make their power much less reduced. So one great example of this is even just Uber. Right? Before Uber, you had to rely on taxi cabs to get around, and that industry was basically completely superseded by Uber and Lyft. And now the market cap of Uber and Lyft is greater than the entire taxi cab industry, and it's just better for consumers overall. Now we have more control over our own transportation and more options. That doesn't mean that the taxi cab industry has gone away, but it does mean that their influence in certain situations has been reduced. And I think that's the ultimate trend. And it's the same thing from these decentralized social applications. I don't think centralized Twitter and centralized Facebook or centralized Reddit will go away per se, but I do think that as these decentralized alternatives gain more prominence, they will actually be far less in control and influential than they are now. And in the long term, 50 years out, I wouldn't be surprised if they go away entirely or like minuscule. But at least, in the near future, within the next decade, I don't think they're going to go away, but I do think that their influence will be decreased.
So then if ICANN is not going away under this premise that you just mentioned, then how do you guard against name collisions, future name collisions?
That's a great question. So for context, there's 1,500, around 1,500 ICANN TLDs. On Handshake, you can register, anything but those 1,500 TLDs basically. And then the question arises, okay, what happens once, if ICANN issues more TLDs? Right now, the GTLD program is not open. And, we've talked to a number of people who are involved with ICANN and the industry. And it seems like, maybe in the next 2 to 3 years, the GTLD program can open up again. Although for context, when we started in 2018, that was also the same estimate. So 2 to 3 years later, the estimate has not really changed. But even once the program opens up, it takes about like a year or more, right? There are still TLDs from the last GTLD program that have not even released yet. They're kind of in dispute and they have some issues with them. But basically, the earliest time span that we're looking at is maybe like 3 to 4 years from now. And then from there, you also look at how many TLDs are registered per year, issued per year. And at max is around like 500 per year, if I recall correctly. So in 3 to 4 years, you're looking at a new TLD issuance of 500 per year. In terms of that becoming an issue, even if you look at the existing growth of Handshake, so within 1 year, 700,000 names have been registered, TLDs have been registered. Let's just round down to 500,000, just make the math easier. So then, 500 out of 500,000, basically you have a 0.1% chance of having a name collision. So in terms of that being an issue, it's like that you can factor that into, how you're kind of estimating the value or how you're kind of estimating, how much to invest and how much to put into the name. But it's like, that's kind of what you're looking at in terms of the collision likelihood. And then also that's in 3 to 4 years. And so, Handshake's already grown this much in this, just 3 to 4 years time. Also now the growth of trends has accelerated, right? Like 50 years ago, for something to grow exponentially very, very quickly, it's very hard because we don't have the internet, right? So like you can only do like word of mouth growth, like based on physical networks, physical social networks, whereas now everyone's online and increasingly, the digital world is becoming, our real social network. And so things can actually proliferate a lot quicker. Basically where I'm going with that is, in 3 to 4 years time, we don't know where Handshake will be. It could all go to zero. It could be worth nothing, or it could be, where I'm at, which is more of like a Handshake maximalist in many ways, just based on what I see in the trends in the internet and just the structural limitations of the existing internet architecture. Basically, I think that the Handshake adoption will be far, far greater than where it's at today. And there's also a huge social trend towards decentralization where people don't want to use the centralized alternatives. And so I wouldn't be surprised if there's a world in which even if ICANN issues those new TLDs, the 1,500 TLDs, they stay useful, but it's basically, Handshake for everything else. And I know that's like an audacious statement. And so I can qualify that with a, number of assumptions, predictions, and et cetera. But I wouldn't be surprised. I think there's a non-trivial chance that we basically enter into that state of the world. And then from there, you don't have any worry about the conflict.
Gotcha. And then in terms of, so it's really these two worlds that are coexisting, obviously with Handshake likely, if we were to, to speculate and say it's likely going to have a larger part of the market share, if you will.
Yeah, I think that's correct. And then also, as I mentioned, there are use cases outside of just pure domain names, right? There's the decentralized websites. There's also the decentralized identifiers, the usernames, as I mentioned, and also those decentralized social applications. And so the names can also be used in a context outside of traditional domain names. Now increasingly Brave and Opera are trying to become crypto-focused browsers, right? They're integrating more crypto protocols or looking at Handshake, et cetera. And when you think about naming systems, they kind of have a winner-take-all effect. within a specific domain, right? So, Facebook has its own naming system, Facebook usernames, Twitter has its own naming system, Twitter, at handles, Instagram as well. And those names actually have value, right? People will pay good amounts of money for the handles that they want. And then within the internet, we have also domain names for our websites. So each naming system is kind of unique to the use case that it mainly supports. And Handshake for the traditional websites is competing with ICANN for that. But for decentralized websites, that's completely new ground that is still just developing. The technologies for that are still very nascent, but people are using Handshake for, even you have a decentralized page at alvinbrown.hns.to, or if you just, have hdns.io set up, you can just go to Alvin Brown directly in your browser. And so, for those other use cases, that's the new ground. And so I wouldn't be surprised if it's something like Handshake basically is the winner within those new use cases. And maybe, ICANN is still very much in competition for the traditional websites. But I don't foresee the traditional domains, gaining traction for these new decentralized use cases, because it's just the way the architecture of the system, of the traditional legacy DNS system works. It's just not really feasible.
In that regard, then, so when we look at browser technology, like what's stopping us from having a situation whereby browser technology is able to intelligently delineate between a legacy domain and send it, or rather retrieve content and display the correct content, using the centralized network versus, this person typed in .Alvin Brown or Alvin Brown / they're actually trying to get to the decentralized network. Let's show them that content. Like, what's stopping that from happening across all browsers just natively? From install and open up, and we type away and live in both of these worlds.
Totally. So there is actually no technical reason why browsers can't adopt Handshake today. And they can even use it for its primary purpose, which is you can get rid of certificate authorities as a trusted third party. And that's a security hole, and actually use it as a more secure root of trust for HTTPS. And it's primarily just a matter of adoption and awareness. So, Brave's taking a look at it. Brendan Ike has tweeted out that, they kind of are developing a plan for Handshake. I think Opera is the next one. Google and Safari and Firefox. I think that one is more longer term, but I do think it's inevitable in a sense, because just as more and more individuals adopt Handshake, it's going to be hard for them to actually go and ignore it. And we've actually been really fortunate enough to speak with Vint Cerf, who is kind of known as like the father of the internet. He invented DNS. We also spoke with the head of security at Google Cloud, and he also managed a certs business. And it was really a fascinating discussion, because with the Vint Cerf conversation, we kind of realized that if the initial creators of DNS had access to the technology that we have today, they would have created DNS in basically the same way that like Handshake works today. It would have been some sort of blockchain-based DNS, because it does solve the main problems that the centralized DNS has. And then the other thing is, we also realized that Google is in the long term incentivized to adopt Handshake. The primary reason why is because for Google, and they've been aware of this trend for a lot longer than we've been aware of, just because of their ubiquity and market presence. They're seeing the trend where more and more of the internet is becoming siloed and siphoned off and censored. It's very, very easy for authorities to actually censor the internet. Traditionally, people in the US have grown up thinking that the internet is this like kind of unstoppable force. And that's primarily because culturally, the internet was started like in the US. It was first, gained adoption in the US. And so, in the US, we have a strong freedom of speech culture, right? It's like baked into the Constitution.
Right.
And so the internet, as a result, kind of had those values. But then now we're seeing actually other internets, like in China, they have the Great Firewall, and they develop infrastructure that basically makes it very, very easy for them to control and censor the internet. And this is something that was actually thought impossible. I think like Bill Clinton has a quote that said, trying to control the internet is like trying to pin Jello to a wall. He's kind of mocking China's efforts there. And they effectively were able to pin Jello to the wall. They figured it out, and now they're even exporting that technology to other countries. So like in Myanmar right now, they actually have had an internet blackout for I think like the last like 10 days or something like that.
Oh wow!
And I think there are even reports of like Chinese government officials like flying in because they're helping Myanmar like with their censorship. And so we're starting to see this huge battle between this like open, democratized internet and this authoritarian, censored internet. And prior to 2020, I think most people just didn't even know that this like authoritarian, censored internet could even exist. And now we're seeing that that's increasingly becoming more prevalent. And from Google's perspective, they've seen that for a lot longer. And that's an issue for them because it's more profitable for them if people all around the world can go and visit google.com without censorship. It's an issue for them if people can't actually go and visit google.com because then they can't sell ads. So it literally affects their bottom line if the internet is a censored thing and that isn't globally accessible and censorship resistant. And so for Google, they're ultimately going to be incentivized to go and adopt Handshake. I think it's just a matter of gaining enough grassroots adoption, because we're not going to be able to get Google to adopt it like this year or anything like that. But as more and more people use it, as millions of people end up coming into the ecosystem, enthusiasts come in and start spreading it and using it, and it becomes increasingly important to their lives. And then the bigger browsers and institutions like Google will realize that in order for them to maintain this free open internet, they can actually rely on Handshake for infrastructure, and then it makes sense for them to go and integrate it.
That makes total sense. And so some of this then is just going to be time. That we're waiting on, likely time and a couple more scenarios to probably play out in real life. Somebody getting deplatformed, or somebody's or organizations getting deplatformed, that then likely opens the door. And like you said, if and when main adoption comes, then it's just a matter, like I said, it's just a matter of time now.
Yeah, definitely. And I typically don't like to make predictions. I think it's very hard to predict the future, but
Right.
Just structurally, something that I'm very comfortable saying is that, we will continue to see more and more issues with consolidation and censorship on the legacy internet. It's just inherent to how it works. There's so many dynamics between, power laws and network effects and just the natural consolidation. And then also in 2020, now politicians are becoming more and more savvy to technology in the internet. In the 2000s, the internet was basically able to grow up without any supervision or influence from politicians because it was just thought of as a toy, right? There's that really famous quote from, that Nobel Prize winning economist that was saying that, like the total value of the internet will not exceed like a few $100 million, right? And then that was just wildly wrong. But that's how a lot of the smartest people in the world thought about the internet, right? It was just kind of this toy. And while it was considered a toy, it grew up and became the behemoth that basically runs our entire lives. So now it's increasingly being looked at by, like political bodies, and with political bodies comes regulation, but also bureaucracy and censorship and, more and more control. And so we're going to just see more issues with the legacy internet. And as those issues come to fruition, there's going to be an increasing pull towards decentralization. And so in a certain effect, it's really just time. The way I see it is as long as the ecosystem maintains itself and keeps on growing and developing and becomes usable, right? We're trying hard at Namebase. I'm glad that you're able to come on, but there's still a lot of issues that we can address that make the onboarding actually easy and then the applications more useful. But as we prepare for that, it's really just a matter of waiting for more of the legacy internet kind of fail over.
Right. Now, in the back of my head, man, I just hear a certain demographic of listener that is saying, okay, great. Tieshun, you all have namebase.io. You're allowing us to basically purchase TLDs, and you're talking about we can become registries through services like gateway.io or whomever. We can actually use those strings as websites. Okay, great. But in terms of what if I don't necessarily feel comfortable in terms of being able to go out and invest and purchase names, whether from the marketplace or whether actually just opening auctions and bidding on them, like, is there still a way to take part in terms of Handshake? And so can people actually just purchase HNS and hold? Not that you would advise them to do so, but is that an option via Namebase?
Yeah, 100%. So you can actually just buy HNS on Namebase directly and hold. And so you can do that, right? So if you believe in some of these predictions or assumptions and kind of just see some of what's happening around the world, and you kind of want to have exposure to that, then you can 100% do that. And I would say, buy some HNS and hold, and also just share with people that and spread the word effectively. But you can also use Handshake names and be an end user without actually going and buying anything, right? Like you can go to hdns.io and configure it on your computer, on your phone, on your router, and then you have access to the Handshake internet on all your devices. You don't have to do anything else. And all your traditional websites will work, facebook.com and google.com and etc. They all still work. It's just that you still now have access to the Handshake internet. So you can actually, one, participate without any capital at all. And then also, if you don't even want to get into the naming, you can just buy HNS as well and hold, and that's completely fine.
Yeah, and definitely, and like I said, don't take this as us telling you to go do it, because I don't want to hear anybody that loses their shirt, house, or anything else talking about, hey, you said go do it. No, I didn't. That being said, so, to take a step back here in terms of now, what is HNS at today?
Yeah, I think as of right now, it is, I'm just checking online.
I think it was like 30 cents or something like that.
Yeah, it's at 30. 33, 32 cents right now. Yeah, two weeks ago, it's appreciated 60% in the past 2 weeks, and then in the past month, it's actually more than doubled. So the price has actually risen, which has been interesting to see.
Because I want to say it was somewhere around, I remember seeing like when I first got started somewhere, it was like 9 cents, and then it went from like 9 cents to 12 cents. And then since then, it seems like it's just jumping leaps and bounds, to a certain extent. And so like I said, I mean, that may be an option for those who feel like, hey, I'm not really ready to jump in or dive in terms of buying names. That is an option of just holding HNS, buying and holding HNS, and just kind of see where this thing goes. Now, in terms of one of the things that I kind of see on the horizon is, could we actually start seeing the pairing of legacy names and Handshake names together to actually increase their value?
Yes, I 100% think that that's on the horizon. So for context, with the name-based registry, we allow anyone to go and start selling subdomains off of their TLD. And it works with the same protocols, is compatible with the protocols that traditional domain registrars expect. So it's a EPP-based registry. And we've integrated with 101domain.com, encirca.com, and gateway.io. And actually, there's more registrars coming on that I'm really excited to share in the near future. But basically, you can list your name on the name-based registry and launch your own TLD, and then you can start collecting revenue from sales from 101 domain and Encirca and Gateway. Now, this is something that's already happening, and basically we are currently working on opening up the registry to more users. Currently, we have like 10 to 15 TLDs on there, and we're trying to automate that so we can have anyone just go and list whenever they want. And you can actually just do it for free, which is going to be really cool because now anyone can just go and start their own registry business off their TLD. But something that I think is really exciting, I haven't seen this done yet, but I'm pretty sure this will be really lucrative because, for context, the most successful registry to date, which has only been live for like a few months, has already had 500 sales at $10 per subdomain. So that's 500 times 10 is 5,000, and that's actually 5,000. It works like a normal domain. They get to set the rules, so it's actually a $10 renewal. So it's really $5,000 per year that they're now earning from that TLD, and that was done with basically very little marketing at all. And so now they're starting to market it. But it's very easy to see how you can take a nice name and actually go and create a business that's generating $10,000 to $100,000 per year. And it's cool because in a traditional world, that would be a failure for a TLD, right? Like the application cost alone is $180,000. But on Handshake, you can have a few names that are just generating $10,000 each, right? It's a niche. Maybe it's serving a niche on the internet that's just too small for a traditional ICANN TLD to serve. But you can serve that niche with Handshake, and generating $10,000 a year, here and there, it really quickly adds up. And it's actually a very substantial business that's very valuable. And it's just something that, an ICANN TLD can't compete with because that's too small for them to actually go and enter into. But the thing that I see happening is you take a traditional domain, like let's say you have NFT.com, and we actually know the person that has NFT.com. So we're connecting them with Jihan Chu, who bought .nft. But that domain name is going to get organic traffic on its own, right? People are going to be visiting that's premium domain. So it's going to get organic traffic on its own. What you can do is you could just like advertise your .nft subdomains on NFT.com. So you can kind of monetize that traffic in a new way and get recurring revenue very easily. And I think that will be just like one really powerful synergy that we start to see happening. The other thing is you can also set up a resolver at NFT.com so that anyone can go and visit, a subdomain at NFT.com and it'll resolve to your .nft domain. So for example, if you have alvin.nft, you can just go and visit alvin.nft.com. You don't have to use a gateway like alvin.hns.to. And so when they buy a subdomain for your Handshake TLD, it now is more valuable than it was on its own before, because not only is it resolvable through Handshake, but it's also resolvable through the traditional internet at alvin.nft.com. So I think combining it in that way, and we're thinking about like making that really easy for domain owners so that they can just kind of do like a one-click configuration and that'll work. But I think combining it that way will increase the value of the names more so than they would have value without doing that combination.
Yeah, because I could kind of see how, like, for instance, I have over 2,300 .com domains. Now, I might not want to go out and bid on all of the SLDs in Namebase as a TLD, but I may want to take my top ones and your top 20 and try it just to see. One, can you actually get the string or TLD at Namebase? And if you can, great. Then you can actually couple those deals together, create yet even more exposure, like you were saying, than what would be with just the TLD by itself or the Handshake domain by itself. Well, I definitely appreciate it. So last but not least, is there anything else that you'd like to share with listeners just about where you see things headed, or, any other pro tips or things to stay away from?
Yeah, totally. I'll just share two quick points. One is, I was recently talking with Nick Carter, who's he's
in Bitcoin, right?
Yeah, he's a very well-known Bitcoin evangelist and writer. He also runs a fund, and they're now getting into Handshake because they have this D-Web thesis. So they just raised a new fund and they have this D-Web thesis and they're getting into it, which was actually, I was super excited to see that. He mentioned it in a clubhouse just the other night because he's a well-known Bitcoin maximalist and doesn't really pay attention to any other cryptocurrencies. So the fact that they're actually paying attention to the Handshake is really cool to see. But their thesis was the same as thesis that I've been thinking about recently, which I think is really important to recognize, which is typically for a new technology to succeed, one is if you look at like technology history, everything that's ever succeeded always had predecessors that like tried to do that same thing and failed. And a lot of times it was two factors that basically prevented the predecessors from succeeding. It was technology and also just cultural zeitgeist. So as an example, before Bitcoin, there are numerous Bitcoin predecessors. But then it wasn't until Bitcoin basically created, right? Satoshi Nakamoto created Bitcoin and encoded all the mechanics and had the cryptography that was necessary to create this incentivized system that the cryptocurrency also started taking off. But also the other thing that you have to consider is that Bitcoin was launched in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. Right. So that was, the primary motivation for it launching at that time. And that financial crisis basically gave people a cultural pull towards the values that Bitcoin was eschewing. And that brought people into the ecosystem. So for technologies, you really need to combine not only a technological maturity, but also a cultural pull towards that technology, towards like the benefits that that technology provides in order for it to actually take off and break into the mainstream and succeed. Because otherwise you have great technology, but just no one really cares about that. For Handshake and the decentralized web, that's really the larger narrative that Handshake plays into, which is the centralized web is now failing, and we're seeing more and more of that happening. And now there's a huge pull towards decentralization. And at the same time, I actually don't know how this like happens so perfectly. And it's crazy to me to see this. But at the same time, all the technologies that you really need to build a decentralized web, decentralized storage and decentralized compute and decentralized naming, they're all basically reaching maturity and becoming usable within the same time frame. It's like within the last 12 months, these technologies have all released. Even Filecoin, it was in development for years and then just finally released. So we see those two factors, those two ingredients kind of existing now and playing out. And I think that's the most important thing for you to consider if you're in the D web, which is the technological maturity and then also the cultural pull towards it. That's the first point I would say. The other point is I've been seeing some comments online about how like all the good names have been taken. It's so funny to hear that when it's just like we're so early. And I'll just say it's like as I mentioned before, it's like we're super early into the entire ecosystem. Like we're still in the early adopter phase. So to the extent that the names are taking, like some of the clear premium, one and two letter names might be taken up, but only 500,000 names have been registered. There's still 2 orders of magnitude worth of growth remaining. So anyone getting in now is still very, very early. And it's really funny just to kind of see this, just because history rhymes so often. In Bitcoin, it was the same thing. When we even just started in 2018, we were hearing so much, the Bitcoin price is so high, we're still so early, just all of this concern about Bitcoin, being saturated. And turns out 8 years in, when, in 2018, I think it was 9 years in, right? Turns out that was still really early and there was still literally 10x growth available. In 2018, I'm pretty sure it hit 3,000 at one point. Or maybe that was 2019. And then now it's literally at like 45,000 or 50,000. So every year people are always like, oh, I'm too late. I wish I got in earlier. It's like the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, but the second best time to plant a tree is now. We're still very early in Handshake in the entire decentralized web. So if you're, concerned about being late, just don't be, just jump in. You're definitely amongst the 1% early adopter crowd, even still.
That is good to know, and that is actually a great way to end it. And so if somebody's wanting to get in contact with you just with additional questions, I mean, how might they do so? Are you on Twitter, LinkedIn? Kind of, how do we get in contact with you?
Yeah, totally. So if you go to nb.hns.to, that's our D-Link, that decentralized profile that we have, and we have a bunch of links there. Our website and our community, we have a community page. As you might have mentioned, the community is really, really welcoming to newcomers and the gift names, and there's just a really good culture there that I think is so important. So if you're new, just check out the community page and join the community. There's a Discord. There's actually a new forum that we're creating as well that lets you log in with your Handshake name that we're announcing very soon. But if you just join the Discord, you'll kind of hear that first in that chat. And then from the link that I mentioned at nb.hns.to, you can find our Twitter and my Twitter as well. So there's a lot of different channels.
Got it. Well, with that, we're out of time. So Tieshun, thank you again for joining us today and sharing this journey of Handshake, man. I hope it does turn a corner. With, like I said, with things the way they are, it looks like it certainly has already turned a few corners. So hopefully it's up and to the right and not down and to the left.
Totally. Thanks, Alvin.
Yeah, thank you. And listeners, thank you for tuning in to Kickstart Commerce, where we share search marketing and domain name strategies to help grow your business. Please subscribe to this podcast via iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or Podbean. And last but not least, please visit kickstartcommerce.com to subscribe to the newsletter, sharing tips and tricks about the disciplines of digital strategy. Thanks, and that's all for now.